Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. I am really happy to bring the conversation I had with Daniel Mendelsohn. Daniel is an internationally best-selling author, critic, essayist, and translator. He's a professor of literature at Bard College. He has degrees in classics from the University of Virginia and Princeton. He's a prolific writer. He's written many articles and essays at the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, to name a few. He's also received many honors from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Guggenheim Fellowship, many awards. Some include the Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France. He's received Italy's highest honor for foreign writers. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association. And he is the person who has completed the newest English translation of Homer's The Odyssey. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We talk about how big the Odyssey is. I mean, you talk about epics, you talk about, big stories. It just doesn't get too much bigger than the Iliad and the Odyssey. And while there's many translations that have come out in recent years for both of those, Daniel gives his view of what his translation is doing. We talk about major themes in the Odyssey. We talk about authorship and the translation for our time. One of my favorite parts of the conversation is where he talks about the lines and meter of the Odyssey in English. Really fascinating. We talk about going from oral to written form, adapting the Odyssey into the new film that's coming out next year, why the Odyssey and its themes are relevant for the 21st century, and many other topics. I had such a delight talking with Daniel about his translation of the Odyssey. It was wonderful to read again. And I have to say, in my mind, it is the best English translation of Homer's The Odyssey that's out there. There are many good ones, but this one is just superb. It is really, really fantastic. And I highly recommend folks getting out there and picking it up. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So please subscribe, share with your friends. All those things are really, really helpful. And now I bring you Daniel Mendelsohn. I am here with Daniel Mendelsohn. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm real excited to talk with you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. You have, really just done something tremendous here with the new English translation of Homer's The Odyssey. I'm a big Homer fan. I actually had just reread The Odyssey a year or two ago, and I was thrilled to know that there was a new English translation. And so it is superb. It is a superb translation. Most people know the Fagles one from the 90s, which is fine. But this one to me is the new standard in English. So, just well done. This is such a good translation.
Thank you.
Before we talk about the translation aspect and then the Odyssey itself, just tell listeners, I guess, who you are professionally, academically, and how you came to do the translation.
Sure. Well, I was trained as a classicist. I did my BA and PhD in classics back in the early 90s and thought that I would pursue a professorial career. But while I was working on my dissertation at Princeton, I started freelancing for magazines and newspapers, and I decided I wanted the writing life. So I moved to the city, and I've been, working as a writer and critic for 35 years now for the New York Times, the various magazines and newspapers, mostly for the New Yorker. and the New York Review of Books, where I'm
Mm,
the editor at large.
mm,
But because of my background in classics, I always, from the beginning of my writing career, I was like Mr. 1-900 classics. If there was a new translation of the Iliad, or if Troy came out, I was the guy to call to write about it. So that's how I sort of developed a reputation in kind of mainstream media as Mr. Classics, which I've been doing,
mm,
really since the early 1990s.
mm,
Um, but I have always kept a hand in the world of classical scholarship. I joined the faculty of Bard College about 20
mm,
years ago.
mm,
I teach not full time, but I teach a course every semester, often on classics, not always, but it's just a way of keeping that material in my bloodstream, so to
mm,
speak.
mhm,
I've only done one other translation, which is actually of a modern Greek poet, not an ancient Greek
mm,
writer called Constantine Cavafy, who lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Um, and the way this translation of the Odyssey came about, so I've always been obsessed by the Odyssey since my early teenage years, I guess, when I first discovered it. I think, like a lot of young people, I was attracted to the adventure aspect of the Odyssey, the encounters with the Cyclops and the Lotus Eaters and the
mhm,
beautiful oversexed goddesses, Circe and Calypso, so that drew me in. As an undergraduate, I was trained and mentored by a woman called Jenny Clay, who's a great authority on Homer and the Odyssey.
mm,
When I went to grad school, I did a lot of courses on Homer and the Odyssey, so it was always sort of um, in my head. And what happened was so I actually published a book, which had I'm happy to say, a great success,
mm,
about reading the Odyssey with my late father towards the end of his life. He
mm.
decided to actually sit in on my freshman Odyssey seminar at Bard College and
Nice.
be my student.
Mm,
This was in the spring semester of 2011. Um, we then went on after the course was finished, we went on a cruise that recreated the voyages of Odysseus
oh, nice.
together. And then he died not long after. So I ended
Mm,
up writing a book about what had turned out to be the last year of his life, which was, weirdly filtered through the Odyssey,
mm,
both in the classroom and then on the cruise. And that book was called An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic.
nice.
Um, and what happened was, so that came out in the fall of 17. And in the January of 2018, I got a phone call from an editor at the University of Chicago Press. Now, the University of Chicago Press produces the most prestigious English translations of Greek and Roman classics.
Mm,
The standard translation of all Greek tragedies is the Chicago Greek Tragedy series. The
mm,
long-standing classic translation of the Iliad by someone called Richmond Lattimore, which came out
mm,
in the 1950s,
mm,
is a University of Chicago Press. But they never had an Odyssey translation on
mm,
their list.
mm,
And so the editor of the Chicago Press had read my book about my dad and reading the Odyssey with my dad. And for the purposes of that book, I had translated, bits of the epic. And she liked the translations that I had done for that book. And she called me one night in January of 18 and said, "Would you like to do a translation of the whole shebang?" And I said yes.
mm,
And so that was January 18, and I turned in the final manuscript at the end of last summer, end of summer of 24. So it was a 7-year
wow.
marathon. So that's how this came to be in a
Mm,
sort of very appropriately for Odysseus, a very oblique way. It's not like I was sitting around thinking, oh, there are no good translations of the Odyssey. I have to fix everything. I've enjoyed many different translations. I've taught many different translations over the
mm,
years, Fagles,
mm,
um, Robert Fitzgerald,
mhm,
Stanley Lombardo,
mhm,
Caroline Alexander. So it's not that I thought I'm the one who's you know, it's going to be up to me to set the record straight. It's just that they asked me, and I thought it was an interesting challenge,
Mm,
particularly because I have been thinking about the Odyssey
mm,
most of my adult life.
mm. Yeah, well, I really do want to ask you about I find, I'll just say, I mean, I've said it before at different points, but in another life,
Mhm.
I went to a theological seminary, and
Ah,
I'm an atheist now. I'm a very loud and proud atheist of sorts, but I'm proud of my past experiences, of course.
hmm
And yeah, I I studied Koine Greek,
ah,
different from Homeric Greek,
very.
familiar of sorts,
hmm
and then a little bit of Hebrew. But translation was always kind of um, in the mix. I mean, we were using a biblical text, but you'd have to translate from the original
Sure,
languages and stuff. So
of
I
course.
feel like for me, without being too much of a nerd, I do appreciate some of the differences in translations,
hmm
and it's a real art and a real science behind translation, and I
hmm
find how people do it differently really really interesting. And so we'll talk about it. I'm curious to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts on it
absolutely.
for sure. Let me just ask it generally.
hmm
I, the Odyssey, I mean, it has to be in terms of human history, especially, I guess. I mean, it's not even written human history. I mean, it predates, it precedes written.
Right. It
It's
precedes
oral
writing.
tradition, right? Yeah.
Right. Right.
Um, you know, it has to be one of the most famous stories ever. I mean, Gilgamesh is probably up there, obviously the Iliad, but the Odyssey is it's one of the most famous poems in the world. It's been an inspiration for everything. You talk about it a little bit in the beginning of the book about for film and TV and
hmm
stories and literature and novels, and
hmm
everyone's
hmm
impacted and influenced by it.
Right.
I guess, what is it about the Odyssey that just makes it this, like, almost, yardstick of inspiration for so many different forms of art? What is it about it?
Well, I think, I guess my answer to that question is uh, mostly because of what's in the Odyssey and partly how it's built, I
Mm,
think, has made it a kind of go-to text. And it's quite interesting, Xavier, because the Odyssey has had many more, as it were, grandchildren than the Iliad has. I think the Odyssey has influenced subsequent literature in a much vaster way than the Iliad. I mean, certainly the Iliad is something so many people have been thinking about over the millennia, but they're not imitating it.
mhm,
They're not mimicking the way it's structured. I think it's really kind of in its own world. Whereas the Odyssey, as you mentioned in my introduction, I talk about all the genres that come out of the
yeah,
Odyssey: science fiction,
mhm,
adventure, the picaresque novel where you have a hero sort of bumbling along through all these adventures.
mhm,
Um, Fantasy literature obviously comes from the Odyssey. As I say in my intro, both Alice in Wonderland and Star Trek have the DNA of the Odyssey, right? Imagining strange new worlds, different kinds of civilizations. So it's interesting, as you say, to think why. I think a big part of it is, as I say, what's in it. So, first of all, it's a great adventure story, right? That's irresistible. You set a clever hero loose in a hostile, dangerous, but also alluring world of strange places and fascinating new cultures. So that's, you know, a big part of it. And as I mentioned, I think young people particularly love the Odyssey because of that adventure aspect. But I think more emotionally, it's about a homecoming, right? It's about this guy who spends 10 years trying to get back to his wife and child, whom he hasn't seen in 20 years, right? Odysseus leaves his kingdom of Ithaca to go fight in the Trojan War. The war takes 10 years, and then it takes him another 10 years to get home. So I think there's something very emotional about the idea of the desperate attempt to come home and the meaning of home is a very great theme in the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
Will they still know who you are when you get back? How will people react? Will they remember you? It's also a great love story.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, I mentioned before that some of the things that Odysseus encounters on his way home are these beautiful goddesses who are in love with him and they want him to stay with them. Calypso, he keeps him captive for 7 years.
Mm,
That's his longest adventure, offering to give him immortality if he would only stay with her. And he refuses
mm,
because he wants to get back to Penelope, his human wife, who
mm,
is aging and will eventually die, but he prefers her to a goddess. So that's a great story right there.
mm-hmm.
Um, and
You see echoes of that in like Lord of the Rings with Aragon and with
yeah,
Arwen. And, like
totally.
you're talking about these themes. I can think of like so many things in our modern time of story where it's like it's just ripping off
Yeah,
of the Odyssey.
absolutely. I mean, the Odyssey is the blueprint. So you have
Yeah.
a homecoming story, you have a husband wife struggling to connect. And I think actually that's kind of anticipates the rom-com, right? A couple, they
Mm,
have all these obstacles, things
mm-hmm.
keep screwing them up, but eventually they get together at the end. It's also, there's another aspect of the Odyssey that I think people don't pay as much attention to, but it's also has the blueprint of the coming of age story because it's
Yes.
also a lot about Odysseus's son,
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Telemachus,
Yeah.
who has been left as a baby by this father whom he never really knew at all. And Odysseus comes back, and now this kid is 20. He's never had a father in his life, and he has to learn, how to be a grown up. And one of the arcs of the Odyssey is watching this young, very callow kid grow up in front of our eyes by the end of the epic. So I think there's that. And also, I have to say, the Odyssey is one of the major themes of the Odyssey is something that we talk about a lot these days. And I think it's one of the reasons it also sticks with us, which is it's about identity. It's a word that comes up a
Mm,
lot these
yeah.
days. But Odysseus, remember, is a trickster character. He's a liar. He's a manipulator. He's very smooth. He finds all different clever ways to get his way or to get out of tricky situations.
Mm,
But he's faced with a kind of interesting conundrum. So he's been gone for 20 years and he has to prove to his loved ones that he is the same person who left 20 years ago, right? Because he's changed. And remember, when he comes home, he's in disguise.
mm-hmm.
So at a certain point, he has to convince his wife, who hasn't seen him in 20 years, that he's Odysseus.
Mm,
And and it raises a kind of interesting question, which is on the one hand, and he does, because they have this secret that they both share that only the two of them know about.
mm-hmm.
So that's what allows him to prove who he is. But I think in a certain sense, it's very poignant because he is the same person who left, but of course, no one is the same after 20 years,
Yeah.
right? He's had all these traumas, adventures. She's had to fend off these suitors who are trying to marry him because they think Odysseus is dead. And so I think it raises one of the really interesting fundamental questions of human existence, which is a paradox that is expressed by the Odyssey, which is on the one hand, we always feel to ourselves that we are the same. We're always the same
Mm-hmm.
I as we go through life. And yet we simultaneously know that we change tremendously as we go through life.
Mm.
Just the natural process of aging changes us. I always make the same joke with my students. I say, you'll never understand the Odyssey until you go to your 20th high school reunion. You know, and people that you dated are unrecognizable to you.
Mm-hmm.
You just wow. Now they're bald like me, and they just don't look like who they were, and yet we know them. So I think the Odyssey is interested in that paradox that you simultaneously are the same, and yet you are always changing. And a lot of the Odyssey sort of works around that. So I think those themes are irresistible. The
Mm.
adventure, the romance, the coming of age story, the identity, the question of identity. These are very modern questions, right? And then to sort of we were chatting before you started recording about the forthcoming movie
Yeah.
by Christopher Nolan. And as I mentioned when we were chatting about that, as I said, the construction of the Odyssey is also very modern, right?
Hmm.
It uses flashbacks, flash forwards, even though it's about the moment when Odysseus comes back and kills all the suitors and reclaims his wife and his child and his kingdom. That's the present of the Odyssey, but it has flashbacks to the moment he was born. There's a very long flashback to all the adventures he
Hmm.
had by the time he gets home. Remember all those adventures I just mentioned,
Yeah.
the Cyclops, Scylla, and Charybdis, those are all told in a flashback.
Right.
But there are flash forwards to the day he's going to die. So
Hmm.
I think the narrative is very jumpy and edgy in a way that feels very contemporary to us. And
Hmm.
as I was saying to you, Nolan is interested in these kind of
Yeah.
twisted narratives. So I
That's
think
his
he might be
wheelhouse.
the perfect guy to do this, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
between its style and its substance, I just think it never stops telling us things that are interesting about what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, I mean, you say that very nicely, and I think that's one thing is in rereading it, I read the whole your whole translation, and I remember thinking to myself, one of the stories that stood out to me this time reading it was Telemachus. That story,
Mm-hmm.
I always before and other times when I've read it, I always think about the gods or about Circe or about Odysseus himself or
Mm-hmm.
you know eh, and this time I just really, and I'm not a huge coming of age story fan. I usually don't love those stories. They're kind of it's sort of a trope of sorts, but I just found it so earnest
Mm-hmm.
and so
Yeah.
real and authentic in a way where it wasn't trying to exactly do that, and that really stuck out to me, and that led me to think more about the story of like kind of the first question I asked, which was what makes this stick, right? Like what makes this, like people decided to write this one down, and then it's been going on for 2,500 years or whatever. Why for me,
Mm-hmm.
somebody in the United States in 2025, I'm still reading this story for so many years,
Right.
and the thing I came to was, yeah, there's all the themes. I just think it's a fundamentally human story. Everybody can relate to it
Mm-hmm.
in a variety of ways. It really is talking about the human experience,
Right.
and many of those themes that you're bringing out: survival, mortality, love, moral ambivalence, identity is huge. And and i and i, and I, I was just kind of struck by it about all these things you mentioned, the marital crisis, coming of age
Mm-hmm.
crisis, political
Mm-hmm.
crisis.
Mm-hmm.
How did he, for Homer, for the author, I mean, we can't really maybe know. We can only, I think, strongly take from the text, but there's different types of relationships that are going on. There's different types
Mm-hmm.
of crises points, and there's different
Mm-hmm.
themes that we're mentioning here. Do you think that was intentional, right? To say, I want to talk about all of this? Or do you think it was, you know what, it's just a story. And if that comes out in the wash, it comes out, fine. What do you think about the space of saying, yeah, I'm going to tell this story, but I want to illustrate many of these psychological or human themes in it? What do you think about that kind of intention?
Well, I think, I mean, it's an interesting question, and as you know, it's a thorny one because it
Yeah.
raises the issue of the intentionality of whoever created the Odyssey.
Hmm.
Um, so, classicists now believe that the Odyssey and the Iliad, were originally composed by illiterate poet performers
Mm.
who took these legendary stories and they turned them into these poems. Remember, the Odyssey is a poem. It's
Mhm.
in verse, and they would recite different episodes, and then over time the episodes would get bigger and they would include other episodes, and finally, it's like Wikipedia, right? Everyone's adding something and editing what somebody else did, and it's a sort of corporate effort. But
Mhm.
at a certain point, I think a lot of people believe that somebody took this mass of oral stories that had been circulating for centuries by different poets in different places and sort of massaged them into the final shape that we have. And that product is clearly the product of a very brilliant poet writer.
Mm.
It's not accidental. I mean, whoever put this together in its final form was a great author. Uh, it's too it's too intricately and deliberately constructed. The structure is so ingenious. That's not accidental. And as you mentioned, the themes are not accidental. I mean,
Mm.
whoever did this was very interested in articulating all of the themes that you and I just, listed: the romance, paternity, growing up. So this is a very deliberate piece of literature. However, it began, it is a very sophisticated piece of literature that very deliberately traces these themes through the stories, right? It uses the story as any novelist would, right? It uses a story to make a point. The Odyssey is a very vast story and it makes a lot of points, but it seems very deliberate to me. I mean, this is just too, as I say, intricate and brilliantly and carefully structured to just be an accidental accumulation of a lot of stuff over many years.
In terms of authorship, I mean,
Mm.
I'm not going to pin you down here. I mean, unless you want to just, unless you want to,
Nobody wants to have to talk about.
if you unless you want to, but was and maybe not like, kind of like you're laying out there. Maybe there was things cycling around. There were performers, things like that. But the person, if it was a person that sat down
Mm.
and compiled it together and really intricately kind of put this kind of structure and hem things into together.
Right.
Is it Homer? Was he a real person? I mean, I've some people have said that yes, and he was illiterate and et cetera. I mean, the only reason I'm asking is because, I mean, again, I guess we'll never truly know, but I guess the reason I ask is because sometimes, for some, not for everyone,
Mm. Yeah.
authorship is really important. Intentionality of from an author is important. A sort of compiler, creator, whatever. It can be important. And again, some people will see that differently. But
Right.
what do you make of the authorship piece?
Well, I mean, as I say, I mean, it's a great debate. It's uh, it really began at the beginning of the 19th century. People thought for centuries and centuries that there was this one guy, Homer, with a beard, blind, and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Um, and and uh, I don't think anybody believes that anymore. Um, I think um, you know the theory that I just explicated about how the Odyssey came into being is now something that most classicists believe, although increasingly in recent years there have been some very prominent classicists who are going back to the single author theory, who think that there really was one guy who pulled this all together and sort of was writing it. I so this debate about how the Odyssey came to be and the Iliad, and whether there was an actual Homer and all of that, is known in the world of scholarship as the Homeric question, capital H, capital Q, right? And people still argue over it. At the end of the day, I'm a literary critic. I'm a writer. What I'm interested in is in the document that's in front of me. I don't I don't have that many dogs in this race. I'm just looking at the text that I'm looking at, and I mean, obviously, the issue of how it came to be does bear on your interpretation
Sure.
of it. But there are people who just work on this stuff. I'm not one of them. I think it is highly unlikely that there was one person named Homer who created, the ancient tradition was that the Iliad was the product of Homer's impetuous youth, and the Odyssey was the product of his sage old age.
Hmm.
It's nice. I doubt it's true because I doubt there was actually someone named Homer, but it's it's a nice way of expressing the difference between the two works.
Hmm. I also wonder, the question is, it's interesting, but I mean, does it really change anything? Does it really matter? I mean, in terms of what you're gleaning from the story, I mean,
Mm,
I don't know if it would, right?
no, I mean there
Mm,
are people who believe that if they accept that there was no Homer or anyone acting like a Homer, so to speak, and this did just accrete over many generations, there are certain issues of interpretation that are then going to come up, right? So there are, throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are whole passages, whole sections that are repeated verbatim. And so somebody thought, well, you could say, this is a trace of what these guys had to do while they were performing. Because remember, they were composing and performing at the same
mm,
time. So if you had a chunk of 15 lines that was sort of prefabricated, then you could sort of focus on the part you needed to make up because you knew at a certain point you could throw in this chunk which is already composed, right? So a lot of people now come to these repetitions, these repeated scenes, repeated phrases and lines, and they find them irritating. They're traces of the process of composition. A lot of translators get rid of them because they feel it's, to a modern day reader, we don't need those kinds of repetitions. I think in an oral recitation, there's sort of these familiar stock moments or sort of things to hang on to, to sort of know where your place is, so to speak. But so there are certain issues of interpretation and translation that depend what you think about whether there was a Homer and how the poem came to be. But it's not something I myself spend that much time worrying about, particularly as a translator, because I'm just looking at what's in front of me and I think, okay, how do I get this across?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Interestingly about the repetition, and we'll talk about that. But as an example, uh, one piece here, she of the bright owl eyes, the goddess Athena addressed him,
Yeah,
right, and then later, she of the bright owl eyes. That's sort of the
right,
preamble every time.
right,
Then Telemachus, sensible lad, spoke to her in turn again, and then
right.
I found that. mm, I found that repetition very comforting isn't the right word, but
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
there's a uh, well, it definitely feels a little bit more poetic in some ways. Oh yeah, this is
Hmm.
a poem. This isn't just a narrative.
Right, right.
But it felt very nice actually. I didn't find it cumbersome at all. I really enjoyed that piece of it. So
Yeah,
I
well,
could
I'm
see why people don't like it, but I personally I really enjoyed it actually.
good. Well, I'm very happy to hear that. So, one of the sort of distinguishing features of my translation is that I reproduce the repetitions. So,
Mhm.
what you're talking about are the so called epithets, right? So,
Mm,
Athena has an adjective that occurs almost every time her name is mentioned,
mhm,
glaucopes, which people translate differently. A kind of standard translation for many years was gray-eyed Athena, and whenever she appears, she's gray-eyed.
mm,
In my translation, it's she of the bright owl eyes because
mm,
I think that's what the word really means. Um, and Zeus is Zeus who marshals the clouds, and
mm,
Telemachus is Telemachus, sensible lad. Even when he's not being sensible, he's Telemachus,
mhm,
sensible lad, right? And to the Greek mind, these were these were important kind of markers of identity that, well, it goes to the theme of identity I was just discussing with you, right? That you always are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain level, you're always that. Whatever else you may do, you're always that. So I think it's very important to give you a sense of that repetition. I also think, remember, the Odyssey is a epic. It's 12,110 lines of poetry. And as you say, I think there's something comforting when you hear these familiar phrases. It helps you place yourself
Yeah.
in a way. And it's not just phrases like the ones we've been talking about. As I mentioned before, there are scenes of 5, 6, 7, 8 lines, which are always verbatim,
Mm-hmm.
repeated like eating scenes. Whenever there's a scene of people feasting, it's always the same 6 or 7 lines. But I think that's part of, Homer is an archaic poet working out of a very ancient tradition. And I think the reader, today's reader, should feel that. I
Yes.
don't believe in sort of simplifying it or making it
Mm.
more easy for the modern day reader. The story is so wonderful, it will carry you along. You don't need to spoon feed it to people. And remember, a big part of what poets do is their style. It's not just what they say,
Mm-hmm.
it's how they say it. And this business of repetition is such an intrinsic part of his style as a poet. And a lot of these epithets are just great. They're just, they're
Mm-hmm.
really
Yeah.
interesting. When he says Zeus who marshals the clouds, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
He's gathering all the clouds together because he's a sky god. So I think it's very, very important. And I don't try to smooth them away. A lot of translators, because they don't like the verbatim, that it's exactly the same every time. They try to vary it. They try to do it differently each time. But I think, do it the way Homer did it. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Well, you're right. I think it allows you to, it's a reminder of something different than what we have now. Obviously, we don't
Hmm.
tell stories that way. But it
Hmm.
also is a connecting point because it says, yeah, this is a bit different, and we can still see human
Yeah.
values and themes. And so
Yeah.
it's a sort of, for me, a type of connective tissue between humans in the past and humans now. That's what
Yeah.
I mean. People still read Shakespeare in the way it was written. Like it's just
Right.
I
Despite
find
the
it
strange of the
right, right,
language.
right,
Right.
exactly. I mean, I loved it. Um,
Good. I'm very happy to hear
so let's talk about translation. So
that.
the big question here, I guess I'll have for you.
Mm.
I'm curious for your thoughts. Is do you feel that your translation is for our time, 2025, 21st century? And if so, how would that match Homer's diction, which my understanding was it wasn't for its time and it wasn't used with everyday language?
Right.
How do you understand this?
So that's the great challenge of translating Homer is exactly what you've just, articulated. So the Greek is a very old language. It's one of the oldest languages, as is in continuous,
Hmm.
operation, so to speak. But the language well, I'm going to just keep saying Homer, even though
Sure.
the process is very complicated. So the language of Homeric Greek is a very particular language. It is not a language anyone ever spoke. I think the listeners need to understand that it is a purely aesthetic language. It's a purely poetic language that evolved over many generations. It's composed of many different dialects of Greek. It shows signs of, if you look at a sedimentary rock and you see all the strata representing different, layers of the Earth's development. Well, Homeric Greek is like that. There are forms and grammars from different eras of the evolution of Greek language, some very old, some more recent. So it's a pastiche that never sounded normal to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking even in ancient Greece, it never sounded normal. So the challenge to a translator is, well, do you want to represent or reproduce the weirdness of it? I always say that So let's say we're talking about the high period of classical Greece, say Athens under Pericles in the 440s BCE.
Hmm. Hmm.
A person speaking Athenian Greek at that time would have found Homeric Greek very strange, right? On the other hand, it was very familiar because Homer was the poet that everyone knew, everyone had to learn it in school. So think of how the King James Bible feels to us now when we read
Hmm.
the King. It's both familiar and archaic,
Yeah.
right? We recognize these phrases through a glass darkly, whatever,
Hmm.
and the Jacobean English, but we know it so well that it's both strange and familiar at the same time. I think that's how Homer sounded to the Greeks.
Mm.
So when you're translating, the question is, well, are you going to write in a very weird English to get that across? I don't think you can do it just because it would come across as a kind of shtick,
Mm.
especially over 12,000 lines, you know. So I mentioned that the University of Chicago translation series has a very eminent translation of the Iliad by Richmond Lattimore from the 50s. And he does use a kind of very uh, archaic English, but it's very consistent and you get used to it very fast. So, like if somebody, disses someone, right? He says he laid a harsh word upon him.
Mm.
It has this kind of craggy,
Mm.
archaic quality. Now, I the sort of paradox of Homer's Greek is even though it's craggy and archaic, it also moves very fast.
Mm.
It's very fluent. So you sort of in English, something that sounds archaic is by its very nature not going to be fast moving.
Mm.
In Greek, it works, but in English, it's not going to happen. So you have to make a choice. Are you going to reproduce the swiftness, or are you going to reproduce the archaicness? You
Mm.
see what I mean?
Hmm.
So an English translator has to choose which elements of Homer's Greek you want to reproduce. In my case, and some translations, some recent translations are very colloquial, very, up to the minute 21st century English. My problem with that is, as we know from our own experience, colloquial language has a very short shelf life.
Mm.
So, it may sound perfect and hip now, but 10 years from now, it's going to start sounding dated.
Hmm.
So I try to use a very plain English, no colloquialisms. Um, every now and then I'll use a slightly old-fashioned word that'll just make the reader think like, this isn't like reading the Baltimore Sun, right? It's a little odd, but not too much.
Mm.
So my approach was to have something that's very fluent, very plain. Whenever I had a choice, for example, English is very rich language, as you know, because we have both a Germanic
Hmm.
origin and a Latin origin. And the Germanic or Anglo Saxon heritage of English is very elemental, whereas the Latinate words sound very fancy,
Mm.
right, to English speakers. There's a difference, say, between right and justice.
Mm.
Justice is a Latinate word, right is ultimately an Anglo Saxon Germanic word. So whenever I had a choice between those two levels, I always went for the Anglo-Saxon to give it a more primal, ancient feel. So I was trying to design something that would not be so up to the minute that it's going to be useless in another 12 years because it sounds outdated, but not so overwhelmingly archaic or poetic that you just can't pick it up and read it. I was treading a kind of a fine line, I would say, and you know, the proof is in the pudding. We'll see what people think.
Well, interestingly, I don't know if you know Damien Searles. I mean, he's
Hmm.
a famous
Sure.
translator. Um, and I remember when I had a conversation with him, in his way, he said, it's my translation. If you don't want to read it, read someone
All
else's.
right.
All right, and he said, I translate it how I want. He's like, of course I'm gonna, you know, uh, take care and consideration, and there'll be hard choices I have to make. Um, but it's my translation. He's like, I
Sure.
don't need to know a language perfect. He's like, I think there's this. Sometimes translators get this kind of elusive, this trap of this elusive like perfection of like I need to be
Hmm.
the best person to speak this language. And it's
Hmm.
like, why? Language changes, it evolves. He was like, so he has a very interesting take on translation. He has a philosophy
Right.
of translation. It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
of course.
For you, generally, how much freedom did you feel? Right, like there. I mean, on a few levels here with your translation to make it yours. So, for example, you know, as you've highlighted, University of Chicago Press, they come to you and they ask you, we
Hmm.
want you to do this. Lattimore sitting on the shelf over there, and then
Hmm.
they're asking you to do one of the biggest stories ever in human history and just translate it. Like, there has to have felt like, okay, I want to get it right. I want to do a good job. Like, so that's a general question. I guess more specifically, maybe drill down a little bit on using the original's complex word and sound play,
Hmm.
the verbatim repetition, the
Hmm.
formulaic lines and scenes. Like,
Hmm.
just kind of walk us through some of that. But yeah, just generally, how much freedom did you have to make it your own with all the sort of, external pressures? And then I guess, how you made these decisions to include a lot of the things that you've been mentioning.
Well, I mean, well, I mean, I spent a full year after I took this commission on just trying to figure out what it should sound like. I experimented with different meters, different line lengths, different kinds of tones and registers, and so to me the most important thing is Homer has a very long line. Each line of Homer in Greek is in a specific meter called dactylic hexameter, which I always say sounds like a diagnosis, but it isn't.
Mm,
And that means it's a long line with 6 beats
mm,
and a very kind of undulating way of unspooling to get to the end of the line,
mm,
right? The Homeric line, a typical line, has a rhythm like bum 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 bum
mm,
bum 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 bum. Right? It's a 17 syllable line,
mm.
and Greek is also a very complex language, has a very complex verbal system.
Yeah,
So
it does.
a single word can express a very complicated thought. So, for
Yeah.
example, in Greek, you can express the idea of the men who are about to be killed in a single word,
Hmm.
right? So you've got a very long line filled with words that are doing each a lot of work. English, so that the typical uh, meter that most English translators use historically when translating Greek and Roman epic is what we call iambic pentameter or blank verse.
Mm,
That's the meter of Shakespeare and often Robert Browning and many poets whom we know.
mm,
And that is a relatively quite short line, but.
mm, mm,
So I wanted to do a line for line translation. So I thought, well, there's no way of getting this everything. So look at a given line, right? It's very long, and each word is doing a lot more work than an English word can do. So I thought to pack that into ba-dum is never going to work.
mm,
So I
mm,
developed a much longer line than most people translating Homer have used, which it's not an imitation of Homer's line, but sort of evokes it. It's a long 6 beat English line, but I wanted that length so I could pack each line in English with what I saw was going on in the line in Greek. And
mm,
there's no way to do that if you're going to use a short English line. So that was the first thing I thought about.
mm,
Um, and then I thought a lot about Homer. Look, Homer, quote unquote, Homer, whoever it was, is a real poet. So they're using all the devices that poets, from Homer to Robert Frost to Anne Carson have used. Alliteration, right? Repeated consonantal sounds, assonance, right, which is the same vowel sound being repeated for a certain effect. You know, the way Homer breaks his line. So sometimes a thought or a phrase will end with the end of a line,
Mm,
but quite often it spills over the end of one line and goes to the next line. That's called enjambment.
mm,
And Homer deploys all of these effects to great with great impact. And I'm trying to, like, if I see a line in the Greek that has a lot of the same consonants, there's a lot of alliteration, P's or T. I want to recreate that in the English because it's not accidental if he's
mhm,
doing this, right?
yeah,
In fact, the first line of the Odyssey is filled with the letter pi, P, right?
mhm,
So I tried wherever possible to recreate the sound effects, the way the a thought will flow over from one line to the other, which gives it a much more drawn out, extended feeling. Those are the things I'm a writer myself, so I'm always thinking about language. What is this guy doing with his language? And as much as I could to sort of reproduce some of these effects in English. But as I say, and as you said, and as Searle said, there is no law that says you have to do it this way or that way. A translation of both the Iliad and the Odyssey that I admire a lot is by Stanley Lombardo, and he has a short English, really very often just a 4-beat line,
mm,
but the guy is a very good poet, and he manages to sort of make every one of his lines pack them with the most possible meaning. So,
mm,
that's another way to do it.
mm.
But because I'm a literary critic and I'm often poring over texts, trying to squeeze as much out of them as I can squeeze, I want my reader to be able to do that. I want my reader in each of my lines to be seeing the same things that I'm seeing in the Greek. That was my mantra.
Mm.
That was my most important criterion. And different people have different criteria, and then your translation will flow naturally from whatever you value the most. But I want my reader to see everything I'm seeing as much as possible, obviously.
Is that what you feel this way in which you're using it, whether it's the 6-beat, 17-syllable
Hmm.
hexameter, or maintaining the repetition, or that? Do you feel like maybe you're not the first or the only one to do it, but do you think that's at least more recently kind of what sets you apart from other English translations that
Yeah,
have
I
come out?
think I'm bucking a trend which has
Mm,
been towards simplification,
mm,
streamlining,
hmm,
modernizing the language,
yeah.
making it contemporary. So I'm pushing back a little bit about that because and as I said, there are translations that do that, which are successful texts. They're
Hmm,
they're good to read. They bring it across, But to my mind, when you do that, you're shortchanging Homer to some extent. So I'm pushing back a little against a trend that's been going on, say, in the past 20 years or so in translations.
mm,
Um, because as I say, I want my reader to see what I'm seeing.
mm,
That's what I
hmm.
kept hoping for.
It does sound what you're doing, the way you're translating is trying to really get at, in written form, and into English, um the idea that it's oral. I guess the question
Yes,
I or at least initially it was oral and
totally.
performed. I guess the question I have here is, so you've seen it in the original Greek that it's written in. I haven't. I don't know that Greek. I have two friends that have tried to learn Homeric Greek, and they just were. I
It's
mean, it's
not
just
easy.
it's absolutely difficult. Um, but what do you think gets lost or missed when you move the poem from oral to written form? I mean, it might just be some of the syntax or intonation or
Mm.
prosody or all these things, but what is it that's getting lost, you feel, Just from if you were to read it out loud in Greek versus
Mm.
to just read it in Greek and then do that into English, I guess. So there's probably a few stages here of where what things can get lost. But what do you think is most lost in going from oral to written?
Well, I think the transition from a performance, a sung perform. Remember, these were sort of chanted, right? So they were sung basically, to looking at something on a page. And I thought about this a lot. The first thing you lose is a sense of rhythm. I mean, think of the difference of what it's like to be read to and reading something. Think of listening to an audiobook versus reading a book. Your whole head is totally different
Mm,
when you're absorbing something orally. So one of the things I worked really hard on was to create it through various means, punctuation, this, that, the other, a way of forcing the reader to be in the rhythm, which is very important. It's a poem, right? It's a poem. So each line, it's very hard to read it even silently without being forced into the right rhythm.
mm,
Um, and the problem also, another problem with blank verse, iambic pentameter, is that it can start to feel like stacked prose after a while. It,
mm,
it can it can lose the bounciness of
mm,
the Homeric hexameter line. So I think that's the first thing, and that to me was paramount. I really wanted you to always feel that you were having that undulating
mm,
Homeric beat,
mm,
because otherwise, Homer had his language, which, as I mentioned, is very complicated, blah, blah, blah. So you always knew it was poetry, even without a rhythm, right? The language itself. Since we're not going to ape that pastiche kind of language, you have
mm,
to find a way of making it feel like poetry,
mm,
to restore the kind of glamour of the poetry. And as I say, part of that glamour is the strangeness of the way Homer expresses things, the stiffness of, I mean, think of the difference between, you know, uh, uh, you know, Achilles dissed, Hector or whatever, and Achilles laid a harsh word upon Hector. You're in two different universes, right?
mm, mhm,
So I'm really trying to. It's what I call, that story about the princess and the pea. I feel like I always want to have the pea under the mattress, that you
mm,
always feel you're comfortable, but there's some little thing that's not quite like everyday speech.
mm, mhm,
And that to me was the most important. So
mm.
it reads very fluently, but every now and then there's like a word or a sentence structure, and you think this is not totally everyday speech, but I think that's part of what
Mm,
poetry is, right?
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not supposed to be, like narrative or something. I mean, I guess it'd
Right.
probably be equivalent of like, trying to read a musical. It's like, yeah, you could read the story and get it, but like there's a song here or
It's not
something
the
like that.
point.
I mean,
Right.
it's,
Exactly.
it's not an exact comparison, but the idea of it. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I'm gonna ask about context here. So moving away from translation, I guess, archaic or ancient Greece
Mm.
is super important. I have to say also, University of Chicago Press did a marvelous job. I mean, it's a beautiful cover,
Oh, I
beautiful,
know, right? I've never
beautiful.
had a more wonderful
Oh my
cover. I'm so
gosh,
happy with it.
the type is amazing. Oh, it's just the whole thing. And inside the book is a kind of like one of these old schooly kind of maps of
Yeah.
sorts to just see it, which is lovely.
The end
And
papers. Yeah.
yeah, it's great. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about more recently on these things is, you know, this is pre Athenian democracy.
Hmm. Very
Fourth
much so.
fourth century, BCE or whatever.
Hmm.
So this time in Greece was different. But I guess the one thing I'm curious about, I'm not trying to get you in hot water here. So,
Mm,
this story takes place around the Aegean region, and I
mhm,
know Greece. It's a Greek epic, a Greek poem,
mhm,
but is it maybe more relevant to see it as an Aegean epic? Because, this is before, Greece and Turkey were lines drawn on a map. And, of course, you've had so much history there.
mhm.
I think to me, again, nobody come after me. All my Greek friends, don't come after me. But I just see this as an Aegean story. Like it's a story of the region. Like, because so many of these cities and places are in what's
Mhm,
modern day Turkey, and
mhm.
sure, like there's a lot of it in modern day Greece. But these
But
places
more
were
not.
it's more regional for me. This is an Aegean story, which is a
Well,
type of region in my mind. So, what do you think about this kind of
no, I
framing?
think you're right. I mean, it's very important for modern listeners to remember that when we think of Greece, we think of that peninsula sticking into the Mediterranean that looks a little bit like an insect.
Hmm.
And but the Greeks thought of the boundaries of their own civilization as covering a lot of what is coastal Turkey today,
Yeah.
right? The Hellenic culture was not confined to the Greek peninsula,
Hmm.
and the coast of Asia Minor was covered with cities that were Greek speaking Greek. They looked like any other Greek city. And that eventually also extended down to the northern Africa after
Yep.
the conquest of Alexander.
Hmm.
So I would only push back, Xavier, to say that I think it's a Mediterranean story,
Yeah.
even more than a
That's all. Yeah.
Aegean, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the Odyssey, and nobody really knows where these adventures took place, although people always are drawing maps about where this adventure happened. And
Mm,
I'm not interested in that. In fact, the maps that you were just referring to in this book, and I agree, it's a very beautifully produced book
hmm.
with the end papers on
Mm,
either the beginning and end of the book with this map. And I decided not to do a map of Odysseus's voyages because that's totally fanciful. I mean, it's
mm,
the places described in the epic are maybe based on real places, but you can't point to them on a map,
mm, mm,
So what I gave you instead was what I call Odysseus's world, which is the world as it looked, in say 800 BCE. I
mm,
mean, but what you do see is that it extends all across the Mediterranean.
yeah.
And
Mm,
remember, we think that the Odyssey evolved more or less into its current form and more or less heavily emphasized there uh, around 750 BCE, which was
mm,
also just the moment where the archaic culture was emerging after the so-called Dark Ages. There was also
mm,
um, trade, colonization, not in the sense that we understand that word, but Greece is a very rugged land, and when cities became overpopulated, they would send out colonists to find arable land suitable for establishing a city. Um, and so there was an awareness of the larger world at the very moment that the Odyssey came into being. And of course, the plot of the Odyssey, the adventure plot of the Odyssey is about someone discovering new civilizations, right? Somebody who leaves home and sees the world, right? So I think your point is well taken. It is
mm,
a Mediterranean poem because he is sailing all over the place.
mm.
His voyages take him from Troy, right? His story or the story of his return begins after Troy falls, and Troy is in what is now Asia Minor,
Is it
right?
modern day
Turkey.
Western Turkey? Yeah.
Western Turkey, but it takes him to Sicily. It
Hmm.
takes him to points that are recognizably part of mainland Greece today. It takes him to Crete. It
Mm,
takes him to different islands in the Aegean.
yeah.
There are people who even argue that the description of certain of the places where day and night are indistinguishable suggests that he gets as far as Scandinavia.
Mm,
There's
mm,
a whole school of thought about that, but it is an outward looking story. It's about wandering the world, both the known world and indeed the unknown world, right? So I do think you're right. It's not specific to Greece as we think about it. It is
Mm,
an exploration of the entire Mediterranean and possibly beyond.
mm, yeah. One of the interesting things, I just read a book by Hugo Shakeshaft. He wrote a book called Beauty and the Gods.
Hmm.
It's a fabulous book, really, really, really remarkable.
Hmm.
Where he looks at the idea, the theme of beauty in Greece.
Hmm.
Um, and he's I mean, that first chapter he talks about how the how to understand the gods in ancient
Hmm.
Greek
Hmm.
mythology. You have to understand them in the context of humans and that relationship.
Hmm.
And beauty's power for the gods. They're always seen as beautiful. It's a very interesting book. I really really enjoyed it. It's really really interesting. I was thinking about it while I was preparing for this. And a question I have here for the
Hmm.
Odyssey specifically is, you know, the gods are heavily featured. Use of disguise is used. All these things, but are they really more concerned with justice than the gods of the Iliad in the Odyssey, which is an interesting theme that comes up. What do you find is the difference between those two epics on justice or other things? This relationship between humans and gods, it feels um, different.
Oh, it's totally different.
What do you make of this?
You're totally onto something. I mean, the sort of theological atmosphere of the two epics is vastly different. So, in the Iliad, as some listeners may recall, the great war epic, the gods are very present in
Yes.
the action. They have favorite mortals that they help on the battlefield. They themselves take part in battles. They're arguing.
Hmm.
There were 12 Olympian gods, the main gods, and six of them are on the side of the Trojans, six are on the side of the Greeks. They appear on the battlefield. They're really in the action.
Yes.
They're manipulating humans. They're all over the place. This is not the case in the Odyssey. The gods feel very remote in the Odyssey. In fact, mostly Odysseus is on his own.
Hmm.
It does begin with Zeus. So remember, at the very beginning of the Odyssey, Odysseus has been away for 20 years. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and handiworks, is his sort of divine buddy and protector. And the epic begins with Athena going to her father Zeus and say, Dad, all these other heroes have come back from Troy except my guy Odysseus. We got to get this guy home. Enough is enough. And he says, okay, let's do it. But after that, the divinities who inhabit the Odyssey are these much lesser, nymphs. And,
Hmm.
it's not, you feel that the gods have receded. And Athena, who I mentioned is his divine patroness,
Hmm.
and clearly has a lot of affection for him, doesn't really show up till the end of the Odyssey. In fact, there's a very funny moment at the end of the Odyssey where he says to her, where have you been during all my adventures? I was schlepping around the Mediterranean and you were nowhere to be seen. And now you're popping up. So I mention this because I think you're very right, Xavier, in noting that there's a different theological feel to the
Hmm.
Odyssey. And to my mind, it goes to what I call the atmosphere. And here's another thing that makes the Odyssey feel so modern: the atmosphere of what I call postness.
Mm.
In the Odyssey, you feel that. Remember, it's a post-war epic, right? The Trojan War has ended, and
Hmm.
now it's just about getting people home,
Mm.
hopefully, right? The great ideological battles are over. The great military battles are over. The gods have receded to Olympus. They're not particularly interested in immersing themselves in human affairs anymore. You're wandering through a strange and unknown world. It's really about, the more I think about Odysseus, he's a kind of proto modernist hero. He's set adrift in a hostile world in which all the old certainties have vanished, and you don't know who is a friend and who is a foe. One thing you knew in the Trojan War is who your friends were and who your enemies were, right?
Yeah.
That's the nature of war. In
Mm.
the Odyssey, everything is much murkier, and the relative absence of the gods is a big part of that. I think theologically, it's much different. We are told at the end of the opening section of the Iliad that all this was part of some great plan of Zeus.
Mm.
So you had mentioned, how do these different epics feel about justice,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and you're told at the beginning that what it is about, this very long poem you're about to hear, the Iliad, is about how the will of Zeus was being fulfilled. So that implies a grand, divine, cosmological plan. There's a theology behind that.
Mm.
It's not clear right away what the plan is, but that's part of the fun of the Iliad, is figuring out what Zeus's plan is and how the action that you're reading or listening to is part of the plan. No such plan in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
very limited and very, in the
Mm.
grand scheme of things, trivial plan. The plan at the beginning of the Odyssey is, let's get this one guy home,
Yep.
right? It's like a shopping list. It's not a grand theological undertaking.
Mm.
So they are quite different, and I feel the relative diminishment of the role of the gods in the Odyssey as opposed to the Iliad that much more highlights the role of the human,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah.
emphasis then shifts to what can you do as a
Mm.
human? Now, it's
Mm.
true, Odysseus gets help from Athena at different point, but mostly it's about this guy having to rely on his wits to get through the world and make his way home.
Mm.
And that's why I feel the Odyssey is incredibly focused on the often murky business of being a human being without the benefit of, say, theological certainties.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I like that because the Odyssey always connected with me more to the humanity of things than the Iliad did. The Iliad is. I mean, I'm not trying to make a direct comparison here, but the Iliad's war and peace. Like, it's big. It's got grandeur. It's
Yeah,
got
totally.
time and war and it's just and it's
Hmm.
wonder. I mean, it's incredible. But I mean, it is. There's a different feel.
Totally.
I so you mentioned it. So I was going to ask you about this. You you get a you get a phone call from Chris Nolan. He says, hey Dan, I hear that you got a translation out, and I'm making a little movie about it. And what should I definitely not miss? What should I not butcher in the film? What are your consultation notes for Chris Nolan, who's making a big movie on it? And of course, his talent is great. He's one of the best directors. But for yourself, who's spent time with the original, you translated the whole thing, you've written about it. What are those notes that you're going to give him generally?
I think the most important is funny because I just wrote a piece about this
Mm.
for a British newspaper, the do's and don'ts of adapting classical epic. Because over the years, I've written a lot about film adaptations or
Mm.
film treatments of Greek and Roman culture.
Mm. Mm.
And I think the biggest mistake to make when dealing with the Odyssey is to tell the story in chronological order.
Mm.
So I mentioned to you just now that the plot of the Odyssey does not unfold chronologically. It does not follow him from the minute that Troy falls until the minute he's finally reunited with his wife. It keeps moving back and forth between the present, the past, the future. And, so the philosopher Aristotle, who was also the first literary critics, he wrote the first really systematic literary criticism treatise called the Poetics.
Mm.
And he talks about bad epic plots.
Mm.
And he says a bad epic plot is one that follows a series of events from A to Z.
Mm.
That's just boring. He said that's history, not epic. Right? Epic is interested in a certain, what he calls an action, and follows all the ramifications of that action, not necessarily in chronological order.
Mm.
So, because the Odyssey keeps jumping around chronologically, I think Nolan is actually a great director to, I
Mm.
hope, to mimic that.
Mm.
Because just as Odysseus wanders in space, the Odyssey itself, the narrative, wanders through time, not in a straight line, but in a circuitous way. And I think think of Oppenheimer, which is constantly jumping between these different storylines, and
Yeah.
you keep going back to moments in the past, and that creates a certain texture, which I think is exciting, and also happens to be very true to the Odyssey.
Mm. I think of
You know,
Dunkirk. He did this. I feel he
yeah,
did this extremely well. Maybe it's because it was in some ways very simple, but extremely well with time. I mean, you could have told that story in a linear chronological
yeah,
order, and it would have been fine. But the way he told it, using with time, was in the whole thing with like air, land, sea, and then
yeah,
past, present, future. I mean,
yeah.
it was amazing. Like it's an
I
amazing way to tell a
agree.
story.
So I think he could be the ideal guy. The other thing that irritates me about all Hollywood treatments of ancient Greek and Roman, whether literature or history, is you have to find a way to make these people talk that doesn't sound ridiculous. You know what I mean? There's a
Yes.
certain kind of language that they put in the mouths of these actors as soon as it's about Greek and Rome, which is so pretentious
Mm.
and so not the way anyone ever talks. I mean, still remember, however, 20 years later after Troy, which I reviewed when it
Yeah.
came out,
Hmm. Hmm.
the Iliad movie, and a guy, a king at a banquet slams his hands down on the table and says, let's keep the women in our beds and the wolves in the hills. I thought in the history of Homo sapiens, no one ever said that. It's just terrible. And so I wish he would just find a natural way to have these people talk, because you can't really relate to them as human beings if they all sound like they're handing down the Ten Commandments every time they open their mouth. So something a little
to,
less
to be
stiff and pretentious.
to be fair, I know he usually adapts he writes the screenplays and stuff. I mean, that has to be a very difficult process to adapt the Odyssey. I mean, I would not want that job. I mean, so
No, I would not want that job either. But I'm not saying I think he's going to make this mistake, but it's top
yeah.
on my list of what
Mm.
I hate about it's like everyone's talking in capital letters all the time. You know what I mean? And it's like, no,
Yeah.
no one ever says, Dad, let's go to the forum. It always has to be like, Father, let us go unto the forum. It's like, give me a break.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Uh,
that's those two things, narrative and speech.
yeah.
I'm sure it'll be eye-popping because he is a person who understands the value of spectacle.
Yes,
And there is
with a heavy amount of realism,
yeah,
literally. So, which is nice.
yeah.
Which is nice.
And there's a lot of eye-popping stuff in the Odyssey.
Yeah. Last question.
Hmm.
Just you've written or you've done a fantastic English translation. One of the biggest stories ever. How is the Odyssey still relevant for us in the 21st century? And what do you want people to most get from your translation?
Well, I feel that, we've talked about um, these themes, which I think are eternal. I want to pick up to answer your question
Mm.
by recurring to this thing I just said about the postness of the Odyssey,
Yeah,
the
yeah, I
sense
like
that
that.
it's about a moment where the big ideas are over and we're all trying to sort of figure out our own way through a complicated universe. And I think, to my mind, right now, that is the most relevant quality of the Odyssey. That speaks to us, I think, particularly strongly in this moment in history. This the sometimes dangerous but sometimes exciting sense that we're on our own, and we're in a world where we have to figure things out for ourselves.
Mm.
And I think that part of the Odyssey, which I've been thinking a lot more about in recent years, is really something we can really relate to. In that sense, it feels very different from the Iliad.
Yeah.
So to my mind, that's really it. This is a post epic, and we
Mm.
feel very
Mm-hmm.
postmodern, post
Yeah.
structuralist, post this, post that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I do think that's the thing. But as I said before at the opening of our conversation, these other themes are eternal. They do
Mm-hmm.
not go away
Mm.
for anyone.
Mm.
Marriage, children, the pleasures of home versus the temptations of adventure. These are things everybody, aging,
Yeah.
whether you're always the same person, how much do you change? Does changing through life make you unrecognizable, or is there still a way to be yourself?
Yeah.
Everyone deals with that. That's what I really finally think the Odyssey can share with us.
Mm. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on. I really, really, really enjoyed the conversation and about
Me too. Thank you.
amazing story, amazing translation. So I'm deeply appreciative for you coming on and sharing all of your wonderful insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.